In the winter of 2018, every cattle operation in Custer County, Nebraska, ran on software. This was not a trend. It was gravity. The county had shifted to digital herd management the way water shifts downhill, not because anyone voted on it, but because the equipment dealers stopped stocking the old parts, the vet schools stopped teaching the old methods, and the young operators who came back from ag programs at Lincoln and Kearney came back talking about data dashboards and predictive analytics and real-time weight monitoring that could tell you a calf was sick before the calf knew it itself. The feedlots had gone digital. The cow-calf operations had gone digital. The cooperatives had gone digital. And in the winter of 2018, with beef prices running strong and every consultant in the state telling producers to push their operations harder and smarter and faster, there was not a person in Custer County who thought managing cattle the old way made any sense at all. Let me tell you about what happened in January of that year, because it is the reason this story exists. And it is the reason one ranch in Custer County runs differently from every other ranch in the county today. January in Nebraska is not a month that offers mercy. The temperature in Broken Bow dropped to 11 below on the morning of January 14, 2018, and the wind came out of the northwest at 30 miles an hour, and the combination of those two things produced a wind chill that the National Weather Service described as life-threatening, and that every cattle producer in the county understood without needing to be told. Cold like that kills calves. It kills them fast, and it kills them quietly, tucked into a corner of a pen where a camera might not reach, or in the gap between two round bales where a temperature sensor doesn't sit. Cold like that is the reason ranchers in Custer County had spent the previous 3 years investing in networked monitoring systems, barn sensors, ear-tag transmitters, automated alert platforms that pinged your phone when an animal's vitals shifted outside the acceptable range. The systems had been sold hard by the ag technology distributors out of Grand Island and North Platte. They were good systems. They were accurate. They gave a producer the kind of oversight that used to require a hired man walking pens at 2 in the morning, and they did it from the warmth of a farmhouse kitchen. On the morning of January 14th, the server infrastructure that hosted the monitoring platform used by most of the county's larger operations went down at 3:18 in the morning. The outage was caused by a cascading failure in the data center that the company used in Omaha, triggered by a power surge during a grid fluctuation. By 4 a.m., the alert systems were dark. By 5:30, when the first producers woke and checked their phones, the dashboards were showing no data, no temperatures, no movement readings, no ear tag signals, nothing. The systems were not broken. The cattle were not being monitored, and 11 below wind chill was doing what 11 below wind chill does to newborn calves who are not being watched. The hotline the company ran went to voicemail. The backup number on the contract went to a regional sales rep who did not answer at 5:30 on a Sunday morning in January. The technical support ticket system, which was also hosted on the same server infrastructure, was unavailable. What the producers had was a dark screen, a dangerous morning, and no clear picture of what was happening in their barns. Some of them drove out anyway, pulling on coveralls in the dark, that did not want to start and driving to their operations to do by hand what the system was supposed to be doing for them. In several cases, was not good. 3 operations in the county lost calves that morning. 2 more had animals showing early signs of hypothermia that required intervention. One producer, a younger man named Tanner who ran a 300-cow operation north of Broken Bow, lost a pair of twins he had been watching closely all week. Animals the system had been flagging as at risk. Animals he had trusted the alert threshold to protect. He did not talk much about that morning afterward, People who knew him said he was not the same about the technology after that, which is the kind of thing that happens when a system fails you at the exact moment you needed it most. Let me tell you about Rosemary Cooke, because you need to understand who she was before you can understand what she did that morning. Rosemary was 54 years old in January of 2018 and had ranched the same 640 acres her parents had built outside the town of Myrna, 20 miles southeast of Broken Bow, for her entire adult life. Her father, Jim Cook, had run Angus cattle on that ground since 1971, learning the work from his own father, who had come to Custer County in the 1940s with $40 and a willingness to do whatever the land required. Her mother, Beverly, had kept the records by hand in a series of green ledger books that still sat on the shelf in the ranch office, one for each year from 1971 to 2003, when Jim's eyes got bad enough that Beverly took over the writing entirely. Rosemary had grown up in that office, watching her mother enter birth weights and weaning weights and veterinary notes in a handwriting so precise it looked typeset. She had grown up walking pens at night with her father, learning to read cattle the way other children learn to read books, by doing it slowly and badly at first, and then faster and better until the reading became automatic. She had taken over the operation in 2009 when Jim's health made it necessary, and she had run it since then the way her parents had run it, which is to say carefully, without debt she could not service, and with the particular attention to individual animals that comes from knowing every cow in your herd by name and history and temperament. She had 210 cows. She knew all of them. She could walk a pen in the dark and tell you which animal was off her feed by the way the group moved around her. She had developed that skill over 30 years of doing it, and she did not consider it a skill so much as a basic requirement of the job. She had looked at the monitoring systems when they came to the county. She had sat through the demonstration at the Extension office in Broken Bow in the fall of 2015, watching the distributor walk through the dashboard and the alert thresholds and the ear tag application process. She had asked questions, specific questions, the kind that come from someone who has managed cattle through bad winters and knows exactly what can go wrong. She had asked what happened when the server went down. She had asked what the backup notification system was. She had asked how long the ear tag batteries lasted and what happened to the data collection when a battery failed. The distributor had answered the questions the way salespeople answer questions they have heard before and have prepared for, smoothly, confidently, in a way that addressed the surface of the concern without quite reaching the bottom of it. Rosemary had thanked him and driven home and not bought the system, not because she was opposed to technology. She was not a woman who opposed things on principle. She had not bought it because she had looked at the gap between what the system could do and what the system could do when something went wrong, and she had decided that gap was too wide for her to trust it with animals she was responsible for. Her method on cold nights was the same method her father had used and his father before him. She set an alarm. She got up. She walked the pens. She did it at midnight and again at 4 in the morning on nights when the temperature dropped below 20, and she had done it so many times over so many winters that the routine had become as natural as breathing. She wore the same insulated coveralls her mother had worn, patched at the left knee. She carried a flashlight she had owned since 1997. She kept a detailed written log, not a spreadsheet, not a digital record, but a paper notebook in her breast pocket where she noted the time, the temperature, the wind direction, and the condition of every animal she checked. On the morning of January 14, 2018, Rosemary Cooke set her alarm for midnight and again for 4. She got up both times. She walked both checks. The temperature at 4 in the morning was 11 below with a northwest wind, and she spent 90 minutes in the barn, moving slowly, checking corners, pulling calves that were showing any sign of chill into the warming area she had set up the previous November. She found 2 calves that needed intervention. She warmed them. She documented them. She went back to the house at 5:45 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and wrote up the night's notes while the information was still clear in her head. She did not know about the server outage until her neighbor Roy Esterholt called at 8 that morning, upset and looking for information. Roy was a good producer, careful and serious, who had bought the monitoring system in 2016 and had come to trust it the way you come to trust a reliable employee. Completely until the morning it does not show up. Rosemary listened to everything Roy told her. She said she was sorry about his calves. She told him what her night had looked like. She told him both her calves had made it. There was a silence on the line. Then Roy said, "You walked them, both checks." "I always walk them," Rosemary said. "You knew that." He had known Rosemary Cooke for 20 years, and he had always known that about her, the way you know things about people you respect. Not as a judgment, but as a fact. He had simply stopped thinking about it as relevant once he had a system that could do it for him. Let me tell you about what happened at the Custer County Cattlemen's Association meeting in Broken Bow 3 weeks later, because that is where the other part of this story lives. The meeting was held at the VFW Hall on a Thursday evening, with folding chairs and bad coffee and the particular atmosphere that gathers in a room when a group of people have recently shared an experience they are still processing. The outage had cost the county's producers something, not catastrophically, not the kind of loss that breaks an operation, but enough to be sitting with. The company had issued a formal apology and was offering service credits to affected customers. The regional sales manager, a man named Gary Elston, had driven up from Grand Island to attend the meeting and address concerns. He was 41 years old and wore a company fleece and spoke with the measured confidence of someone who has prepared for a difficult room and believes preparation is the same thing as readiness. He explained the outage. He explained the redundancy improvements the company was implementing. He explained that an event of this type, a cascading data center failure, combined with extreme weather conditions, was statistically very unlikely to recur. He said the word statistically twice. He said the systems remained the best available option for herd monitoring in conditions, exactly like the ones the county had experienced. He said this was a one-time failure in an otherwise reliable technology ecosystem. It was Owen Birdsell who brought up Rosemary Cooke. Owen ran a small operation west of Myrna and had known Rosemary for 30 years and had driven past her ranch on his way into Broken Bow that morning and had seen her in the barn at 5:30 doing her final check in the dark. He mentioned it the way you mention something that seems self-evident once you have said it out loud. Rosemary Cooke ran 2 manual checks that night, Owen said. Midnight and 4. Paper log, flashlight, the whole thing. She's done it that way her whole life. Found 2 calves that needed warming. Both lived. The room was quiet for a moment. Gary Elston nodded in the way that salespeople nod when they are acknowledging a thing they plan to redirect away from. "That's great," he said. "That's exactly the kind of dedicated producer we all admire. But let's be honest about what that represents in terms of scale. Rosemary's running, 200 cows. The producers in this room running 600, 700, 800 head cannot physically walk every pen at midnight in 11 below weather. The monitoring systems exist precisely because the manual approach doesn't scale." He said it reasonably. He said it with the particular confidence of a man who has confused operational scale with operational wisdom. A few people in the room nodded. A few did not. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone reframe a working solution as irrelevant because it didn't fit the problem they were selling an answer to? Not because the solution failed, not because it was inadequate, but because acknowledging it would require acknowledging that the system they sold you was not the only way to get the job done. Gary Elston was not a dishonest man. He understood livestock monitoring technology better than most people in that room. But he had spent 6 years building a business on the premise that the new method had made the old method obsolete, and that premise had become the floor he stood on. He could not afford to look at what was under it. Rosemary was not at the meeting. She rarely attended association meetings. She had cattle to feed. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened at her ranch on a Tuesday morning in late February, because it is the one that matters most. Gary Elston drove out to the Cooke Ranch on his own initiative, without a sales purpose, or so he told himself on the drive out from Grand Island. Though the instincts of a salesman are not always easy to separate from the instincts of a person. He pulled into the yard and found Rosemary in the calving barn, working a difficult presentation on a first calf heifer with the calm efficiency of someone who has done this hundreds of times. He stood in the barn door and waited without being asked to wait, which was the first intelligent thing he had done in connection with Rosemary Cooke. When she had the calf on the ground and the heifer up and the situation settled, she cleaned up and looked at him. "Gary Elston," she said. It was not a greeting. Exactly, it was a confirmation. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I wanted to come out, and I owe you an acknowledgement. The things Owen said at the meeting, about your checks that night." He stopped. He was a man who was accustomed to having a structure for his conversations, and this conversation did not have one. "Your calves lived," he said finally. "I wanted to recognize that." Rosemary looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Come in out of the cold." She had coffee on the kitchen stove, the old kind in a percolator, and she poured 2 cups and sat across from him at the table where her mother's ledger books were stacked on the shelf behind her. Gary sat and looked at the ledger books the way people look at things they haven't seen in a long time and thought were gone. "The system you sell is a real system," Rosemary said. "I'm not here to tell you it isn't. The ear tag data, the threshold alerts, the temperature trending, I understand why people use them." She set down her cup. "But your system needs 3 things to work. It needs power, it needs connectivity, and it needs someone who knows what to do in the gap between when the alert fires and when they get to the barn." She looked at him steadily. "My system needs one thing. It needs someone who shows up." Gary was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his coffee. "The outage affected 19 operations in this county," he said. Not defensively. He said it the way a man says a number he has been carrying for weeks and needed to put down somewhere. "I've counted it. 19. Operation Flying Dark on the worst night of the winter." "I know," Rosemary said. "Roy told me. How do you stay current on 200 animals in the dark? In that temperature?" His voice had changed. The sales cadence was gone from it. What was left was a straightforward question from a man who genuinely did not know the answer. Practically speaking, how do you actually do it? Rosemary stood up and walked to the window that looked out over the calving barn. The morning light was thin and gray, the way February mornings in Nebraska are thin and gray. "You build a picture," she said. "Over time, over years. You know what a healthy animal looks like at 2 in the morning when it's cold and it doesn't want to move. You know the difference between a calf that's resting and a calf that's in trouble, and the difference is subtle, but it's there, and you learn it by looking at thousands of calves until it becomes the kind of thing you know before you know it." She paused. "The sensor tells you the number. I already know what the number means before I walk in the door, because I've been walking in that door for 30 years. Gary looked at her for a moment. Then he said, That's what the predictive analytics are trying to do. Build that picture algorithmically. Yes, Rosemary said. And on a good day with a good signal and a working server, they do it reasonably well. She turned from the window and looked at him. But they don't do it on a bad day. Gary drove back to Grand Island that afternoon with something he had not brought with him: a specific and accurate understanding of the difference between monitoring an animal and knowing an animal, and the way that difference becomes critical in the moments when the monitoring fails. He did not stop selling the systems. They were good systems, and the county needed them. But the conversation he started having with his customers after that February morning was a different conversation. He started asking them what their backup protocol was. Most of them didn't have one. He started telling them they needed one. He started telling them about Rosemary Cooke, not by name, but as a framework, the producer who ran paper checks and kept a handwritten log and knew her animals well enough to find the ones in trouble in the dark without any systems telling her where to look. Let me tell you about what happened at the Custer County Extension Office in the spring of 2018. Because the story does not end in Rosemary's kitchen. The Extension livestock specialist that year was a woman named Christine Abbott, who had been covering the county for 9 years and who had watched the digital monitoring adoption curve with the measured attention of someone whose job was to track what actually worked for producers in actual conditions. Christine had spent the weeks after the January outage talking to affected producers and compiling a quiet internal summary of what the night had cost and what had prevented loss on the operations that had not been affected. She had noticed something. The operations that had fared best that night shared a common characteristic that had nothing to do with the sophistication of their equipment. They were operations whose managers had maintained some form of direct physical check protocol alongside whatever technology they ran, producers who still got up in the night, who still walked pens, who still knew their animals well enough to notice when something was wrong before a screen told them. The technology on those operations was a layer added on top of a foundation that already worked. On operations where the technology had become the foundation, the night of January 14th had exposed what was underneath it. Christine put a single paragraph in her spring newsletter suggesting that producers consider their monitoring systems as supplements to direct observation rather than replacements for it. She did not name anyone. She did not mention the outage directly. She simply said that no alert system, regardless of how sophisticated, could substitute for a producer's direct knowledge of their own animals, and that the ranches she had observed maintaining that knowledge through consistent physical checks had weathered the winter's hardest night in the best condition. The newsletter went to 480 producers in Custer County. Rosemary Cooke read it at her kitchen table with her second cup of coffee and set it down and did not say anything about it to anyone. But 11 producers called the extension office that spring asking about calf checking protocols. Christine referred 4 of them to Rosemary. 3 of those 4 drove out to the Cooke Ranch over the course of May and June, when the worst of calving was over, and the ground was soft and there was time to talk. Rosemary showed them her log system, the notebook, the entries, the shorthand she used to track individual animals across multiple checks. She showed them what she looked for in the barn at midnight and what she looked for at 4, and why the 2 checks mattered differently because the cattle's behavior changed across that window in ways that were specific and readable once you knew them. She showed them the way you show someone something you have done 10,000 times, without drama, going through it in order, taking questions as they came. One of those 3 producers was a man named Chet Alderman, 37 years old, who had been running 400 cows north of Broken Bow for 6 years on a full digital monitoring platform and had never once walked a pen check in the middle of the night because the system was supposed to make that unnecessary. He had been one of the producers who lost calves on January 14th. He sat in Rosemary's calving barn for 2 hours that June afternoon and asked more questions than the other 2 producers combined. At the end of the afternoon, he asked if he could come back in the fall, before calving started, and walk through a check with her so he understood the sequence before he tried it himself. Rosemary said yes. Let me tell you about the fall of 2018, because it is where the story turns forward. Chet Alderman came out to the Cooke Ranch on a cold evening in late October before calving had started for either of them and walked a barn check with Rosemary. He watched the way she moved through the pen, not fast, not slow, but with a particular quality of attention that he recognized as the same quality he had seen in the best mechanics and the best horsemen he had ever known, people who had done a thing so many times that their observation had become precise in ways they could no longer entirely explain. He watched the way she noticed things. The angle of a cow's ears, the spacing between animals, the way one heifer was standing 2 steps apart from the group in a way that meant something to Rosemary that Chet could not yet see. Rosemary explained what she was seeing as she moved, not lecturing, just narrating her own attention, the way a skilled craftsman narrates their hands when they are teaching. After the check, standing in the cold outside the barn with their breath showing in the flashlight beam, Chet said, "I don't see what you see yet." "No," Rosemary said, "you won't for a while, but you'll start to see pieces of it." He went home and built a check log modeled on Rosemary's notebook. He ran it alongside his monitoring system through the winter of 2018 and 2019. The digital platform worked fine that winter. He did not need the manual checks as a backup, but by March of 2019, he had begun to see pieces of what Rosemary described. The way the barn had its own grammar at midnight, its own syntax at 4 a.m., a language in the posture and movement of the animals that the ear tag data reflected only in numbers, and that the numbers alone did not fully translate. In the winter of 2019, a firmware update to the ear tag readers on 2 of his 4 pasture groups produced a calibration drift that took 10 days to identify, during which the temperature alerts were triggering 3 degrees high, and he had been responding to false positives twice a night. It was his manual check on a Tuesday morning in February that caught the one real case in the middle of the false ones. A calf that was genuinely in trouble, whose ear tag was reading fine because the calibration drift had pushed its apparent temperature into the normal range. He found the calf because he knew what a calf in trouble looked like, not because a system told him. He did not tell anyone that story at the time, but he told it to the 4 producers who called him the following spring after Christine Abbott's follow-up newsletter, and he told it accurately, without embellishment, the way you tell a story when you want the person hearing it to understand what actually happened. Let me tell you one last thing about Rosemary Cooke, because the story has one more turn. In the spring of 2022, Rosemary's daughter, Sarah, moved back to the ranch from Omaha, where she had spent 8 years working in agricultural software development, specifically in the kind of livestock monitoring platforms that Gary Elston's company sold. Sarah was 31 years old and knew those systems from the inside, knew their architecture and their failure modes, and the assumptions built into their alert algorithms in a way that most producers who used them did not. She had come home because her mother needed help with the operation and because she had been working on a screen long enough that she wanted to work with her hands again. She sat at the kitchen table with Rosemary in the evenings that first spring, going through the ledger books and the notebook logs and the 40 years of accumulated paper record that the Cook Ranch ran on, and she understood something that she had not understood when she was writing monitoring software in Omaha. That the data her mother kept in handwriting on paper was the same data the digital systems were trying to capture, and that her mother's ability to act on that data without a system processing it for her was the thing the systems had never quite managed to replicate. Not because the technology was inadequate, but because the knowledge that made the data meaningful lived in the person who had gathered it, and that was not a problem software could solve. Sarah put a digital system on the ranch that fall, a good one, current generation, with the redundancy built in that the 2018 systems had lacked. Rosemary did not argue against it. She said, "Put it in, it's a good tool." And then she said, "But walk the checks through the first winter, walk them the way I walk them. Get the picture in your head before you let a screen hold it for you." Sarah walked the checks. Her neck ached from the cold, and her eyes ached from the dark, and by the third week of January, she had started to see what her mother had been trying to describe for 30 years. The grammar of the barn at midnight, the particular kind of stillness that meant something was wrong somewhere in the pen. By February, she had started catching things before the system flagged them. Not often, not liably, not yet. But sometimes, and the sometimes mattered. The digital system is still running on the Cook Ranch. Sarah uses it every day and considers it essential. But the paper log is still in the breast pocket of her coveralls on cold nights, the same pocket where Rosemary carried hers, and she fills it in by flashlight the same way her mother filled hers in, because some information only exists when someone is there to gather it, and a screen in a warm house cannot be there. Rosemary Cooke is 60 now and does not run the night checks herself anymore. Sarah runs them. On the hard nights, the 11 below nights, when the wind comes out of the northwest and the temperature drops fast, Rosemary sometimes gets up anyway and stands in the barn door and watches Sarah move through the pen. She does not say much. She watches the way you watch something you spent 30 years building and are now watching someone else learn how to carry. On the night of January 14, 2018, every monitoring system in Custer County went dark. One rancher, who had never asked a server to know her animals, walked her barn twice in 11 below weather and found the ones that needed her. Both calves lived. The server came back up the next morning. The alerts resumed. The dashboards showed green, but in the barns on the operations where producers had lost animals. That night, the loss was already done, and no alert would undo it. Some knowledge does not live in a system. It lives in the person who shows up in the dark and already knows what they are looking for. And the calves, as Rosemary Cooke would tell you if you asked, do not know the difference between a sensor reading their temperature and a person who has known their mother since she was a heifer. They only know whether someone came.